Museum Director. I not only want to welcome you, but also to thank Vince Rossi, who is the organizer of this series, and he will introduce our speaker of the day. Vince?
Thank you, John. Welcome, everybody. Glad to see another nice turnout here. Really appreciate you coming in. And it's my pleasure today to introduce Mr. George Gray and his wife, Anita, from Los Californianos, a group that will talk to us about another aspect of the very diverse history of our region, and we're very much interested in sharing this varied history with our audience and members, and glad that you can attend. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. George Gray.
Thank you. Wait till I'm done. Yeah, I am George Gray, and I'm in the costume that is verified by Old Town San Diego, because my wife and I have both been docents there for a number of years. I'm getting too old that I don't like to drive at night, so we are very seldom in Colorado, San Diego nowadays to serve as docents there, but I am an active docent at Rancho Bernardo, your neighbor, and I've got some handouts here about that rancho if you want. And these are the handouts for the Los Californianos, and I'll ask just to circulate with the group so that you have those. My costume, I normally wear this heavy coat, but I'm not going to do that. And my costume is verified except for the buttons on my fly. And I kept telling them I don't show those to everybody because they're plastic. And today I'm wearing a watch, so I'm out as far as that's concerned. But I do have my pocket watch here. And I'm dressed as a New England captain, which they called in Alta California one of the Boston ships. And over a period of time, I've played the captain from anywhere from 1810 to 1850, a number of different captains, and some of them I'll relate to when we get into the stories of early California. Los Californians itself has a strange name because it's California with the NOS at the end. And that was because at the time that we applied for the nonprofit, somebody already had Californios, which is a logical name for the organization. So we had to pick a substitute for that name. The organization itself was formed in 1969, and it was in preparation for the 200th anniversary of the first sighting of San Francisco Bay. And the organization is still somewhat dominated by Northern California members and so on because of its original origin. It has been involved in sponsorships of early California events, most notable being the ANZA celebration, which is held annually in San Francisco at the present time. And also involved in publications. I won't go into very much detail because that's in the handout. I would urge you to take note that on the last page is reference to the website, and you can go on that and find out a lot of information. If you have any questions about early California under the Hispanic, Spanish, and Mexican regimes, you can put in a pregunta to the website, whether you're a member or not, and you'll get an answer from members and so forth to your questions over time. Let's see, that's about, the membership is also detailed there, although it doesn't say much about what the costs are. I am an espousal member because I'm a first generation Californian. My wife is a 9th generation Californian. And our grandchildren then are 11th generation California. And that's about as far back as you can go without getting involved in the natives. One of the stories that I'll tell later is her story of the early California, and this is what she used as a proctor when she was a docent in Old Town. In Old Town, she played a role of early Californian gambling woman and so on, and she taught card tricks and so forth for that period of time. So, enough for that part of the presentation. The next thing I want to talk about is my experiences as a docent and the things that I tended to stress carrying out the responsibility of most Californianos to preserve the heritage of Hispanic California. And it's very interesting being a docent. You have to learn a lot about what the speakers, what they're interested in at the time, and depending on whether it's a family with little kids and so on, they're most interested in the spiders and the lizards and so forth that are on the Rancho Bernardo grounds than they are the history and so forth. But the things that I've learned about being a docent, one of the first questions is, why did Spain settle Alta California? Well, first I want to deviate a little bit. The problem between Nueva California and Alta California. Officially, under Spain, it was Nueva California. And that goes clear back to when Cortez tried to make a settlement in what he thought was an island of California, way back there in 1535. He didn't manage to get the settlement to last, but that was the first attempt of the Spaniards to settle any of the Californians. And California was just this island out there. They thought, well, they later found out it wasn't an island. And when the Jesuit order was given the responsibility for establishing missions in California, that is all that it was. The King of Spain decided, and I'll talk a little bit about the problems that Spain was having at the time, that he needed to be sure that New Spain, as they called it at that time, was well governed and so forth. He sent a visitor by the name of Galvez. Now that family is prominent in New Spain. We know that because of Galvez Town, Texas. And Galvez, part of the Caribbean Sea, that area is called Galvez Sea, and so on. He sent the visitor. The visitor then made some adjustments to the military, and the visitor outranked the vice king in New Mexico at the time. And one of the things that they recommended is that they establish a fort at Monterey. And that was because Monterey had been sighted and so forth before by Spanish explorers. And it was where the Manila galleons first reached land in North America. Now the Manila galleons started in 1565. And almost every year, not quite every year, one or two ships left Manila for Acapulco. And with the trade winds, they would hit North America at about Monterey. And that was fine as long as the Pacific Ocean was a Spanish ocean at that time. But the English got word, and it didn't take long before the English captured one of these rich ships. Captured it really near Ensenada in Baja California. Okay, so under Spain it was New California and Antigua California, which was Old California. And it wasn't until the Mexican Constitution of 1823 that it was designated Alta California and Baja California. You know now Baja California is really two states within Mexico, Baja California and Baja California Sur. And we are the old Alta California. The original line was south about 10 miles lower down in Baja California than the present line. And it was the demarcation between the influence of the mission at San Diego and the northernmost mission that by then the Dominicans had in Baja California. They actually drove a stake in the ground and said everything north of this is Alta California, south of this is Baja California. Okay, so the next thing that I said, so the settlement in Alta California was not to convert the Indian or anything like that, but it was a commercial venture. It was to protect the Manila galleons, which were very important as far as Spain was concerned. Spain would send every year a ship to Manila with silver and whatever products that Mexico had that was of interest to China. And Manila was a gathering point for all of the riches of the Orient to come eventually to Spain via Acapulco and Veracruz. Okay, so the settlement, the religious part of it, the conversion of the Indians was just a side issue as far as Galvez was concerned. Okay, Spain's problems at the time. One of the things you have to remember is this was a very unsettled time in Europe because of the French and Spanish and English and Russian and German problems. And actually, what Benny called the First World War was what we were taught in school was the French and Indian War. Well, it really was the French and Indian and Spanish and Russian and German war. And there was fighting in India, which England won. There was fighting in the United States, which England won over the French. That's when Canada became English. And there was fighting in the southern part of the United States between the English and the people that were governing at that time, Spain. The cities of Baton Rouge, Mobile, and all of those in the southern tier of the United States were captured from the Spanish through the English at that time. And so this was a festering point as far as Spain was concerned. And a little bit of a side issue is that then when the Revolutionary came, well, Spain helped capture those cities back from England to the United States. And we learned a lot in school about the French and help at Yorktown and so forth, but most of the 10,000 uniforms were from Spain. And when you see pictures of the Continental Army in their nice uniforms, those weren't manufactured in the United States, in the colonies at that time. They were manufactured in Spain. And it's said that the gunpowder that was used at the Battle of Saratoga was all Spanish gunpowder. And Spain just doesn't give them much credit for those early things. This is an example of what was going on at that time in Spain. Okay, the next thing that I tend to specialize is that there are no Spanish land grants. And people don't believe that because we're taught in school that there were Spanish land grants. This was a Spanish land grant. It wasn't either. It was a Mexican land grant. And Spanish only gave concessions. And the first concession was given in 1775, and it was a man that's on this chart that I'll talk about later by the name of Boutron. And the soldiers that came up from Mexico with the Portola expedition were of two varieties. The main ones were what they called the leather jacket soldiers, the soldados de cuero, and the second ones were 25 soldiers that came from the Catalonian volunteers that came basically from Guadalajara in Spain. They came to the New World and so forth. They came by ship up to San Diego. And of those 25, 12 of them died before they were able to have any influence or anything on California itself. About half of the rest of them were in the Portola expedition that went by land from San Diego up to San Francisco. And those two varieties of soldiers were very different. The Catalonian volunteers tended to be young men that were soldiers. Basic thing is for soldiers is to get the young generation, unfortunately. And the leather jacket soldiers were older men, mostly married, mostly able to read and write and so forth, and most of them had a second profession because they were taught by the Jesuit order at that time of the missions to help the missions and so on. There's a lot of difference between those two organizations. Spain gave what they called concessions, and the concession meant that you could occupy the king's land, but you could provide crops from it and run cattle, sheep, whatever on that land, but it was the king's land, and it was held for the Indians once the Indians became converted and so forth. And the missions were to become the parish churches at that time. That didn't work because things happened in between. But there were no Spanish land grants, there were Spanish concessions. Another thing that people don't realize is that the small number of people that were involved in the settling of Upper California at the time. Under Spain, in the figures that I use, because it's easy to remember, in the year 1800, it's estimated that there were 1,800 non-Indians in Upper California. And that's very few people. That's just a small neighborhood in California at the present time. Along with very few people is this short period of time involved. Spain was in charge of Upper California for 2 generations, about 50 years, and that's all. And Mexico was responsible for North California 1 generation, 25 years, from 1822 to 1848. And that's a very short period of time. I remember when I was growing up, I lived in Harbor Heights at that time, and there was a program on KFI called Romance of the Ranchos that tells about the early California ranchos and so on, and their influence on California. And this was during the war that it so happened, so on. And that Romance of the Ranchos is very short. And as far as the history of Upper California is concerned, one of the worst things that happened in getting people to understand the history of Upper California is Dana's book, 2 Years Before the Mass, because he came during the height of the Romance of the Ranchos period. And so most people think that all of the Spanish period and the Mexican period were the Romance of the Ranchos. There were very few ranchos at the time of Spain. It has been estimated, and it's hard to judge because the first Spanish concession, for instance, he only kept it for a couple of years because he really wasn't interested in farming as we understand it now, so on. So only about 40 concessions existed. There were none in San Diego County. They were all in the Los Angeles area and San Jose and San Francisco and a few in Monterey. Okay. The other thing I tried to get people to understand is the Spanish and the Mexican government knew that there was gold in California. And I have records of one of the ships that traded in California at that time, 1808 this was, and what they were trading for was either fur pelts, and this was trading with Chinese goods and a lot of stuff from New England, especially iron products and so forth, or Dutch doubloons, which were common in the Far East because of the Dutch settling in the Java Sumatra area, and Spanish pieces of 8. And, you know, one of the kind of a side issue, we still speak of a quarter being 2 bits. Well, that's 2 bits because that's 1/4 of the Spanish piece of 8, the real. 1/4 of a real is 2 bits. And we still use that term in the United States, besides all the Spanish names of the cities and the counties and so on that we have. Okay, as a docent at Rancho Penasquitos, I also tried to get them to understand that it was the waypoint for the Army of the West that came from Mule Hill down through Rancho Bernardo here to the Rancho at Penasquitos and so on, and the value that it had for a place for those soldiers and so forth to kind of get their bearings and so on. And also Rancho Penasquitos, which lays in the valley of Penasquitos Canyon and so forth, is a point for animals to circulate throughout the San Diego area, which present day is a very important thing. Okay, I'd like to get now to the stories. And the first story that I'll relate to and examples of what it is my wife's story, and this is what she used as a docent at Old Town. And she portrayed this woman as a gambler and so forth. But her ancestry goes to some of the prominent families in the early days of California. And this is Jose Ortega, I think, the first one. He was a sergeant when the Portola expedition came up. He was a soldier, leather jacket soldier. He was able to read and write. In fact, when Father Serra was having problems with the military governor of California at the time, he recommended that Ortega become the governor of California in place of, so he was very sympathetic to that. He was given one of the early Spanish concessions, which will come up later in one of the stories, at Refugio Beach. Okay. Refugio Beach is important in our history right now because of the fire that took place just a couple of weeks ago that destroyed some of the facilities at El Capitan State Beach. Well, El Capitan was the Spanish land and Mexican land grant to the son of Ortega's and named after his father. By that time, he was a brevet, they call it captain in the Spanish army at that time. And also they had an oil spill about 6 months ago at Refugio. Refugio is about 20 miles west of Santa Barbara. Okay, the next one on here is, important to point out that Ortega was married to a Carrillo, and that's the Carrillos family and a lot of the other Carrillos and so forth within California. And that next family of importance is the Arce family. And the Arce family is still prominent in Baja California. Fairly recently, the governor of what's the name of the town? Where the Presidio is in Baja California. Laredo, okay. Laredo. I keep mixing it up in my own mind with Texas.
That's not Laredo. This is Laredo.
I'm soon to be 89 years old, and sometimes my brain and my mouth get mixed up and send different messages, and I'm sure many of you are having that same problem down there. So my wife will correct me usually. Arce was the grandson of an Englishman, as far as we know. He's a red-headed, blue-eyed Englishman. And an Arce descendant was the guide for Harry Crosby on the book that he did on the Mexican pictographs. So that family is still prominent in Baja California. The next one on here is Boutron. And Boutron was the Catalonian volunteer that I had mentioned. And he served his time, and in 1777, he was given the first Spanish concession in the town of Monterey. And it was a few acres, really, and he didn't keep it very long. He married an Indian woman. So my wife, besides all of the Spanish, has an Indian woman. And the story of that is very interesting, and one of the things that I kind of honor Father Serra for. The King of Spain granted permission for 5 of the Catalonian volunteers to marry Indian women. And this was in, like I said, in 1777 period. And Father Serra would not marry 3 of them to the Indian women because he said they don't deserve it. So, kudos for him. One of the other ones that was given permission to marry was the only person that I know of that was a Catalonian volunteer and later enlisted to be a soldier, a leather jacket soldier, and that is the Yorba family. Most of you know Yorba Linda, where Nixon was born and so forth, the upper Santa Ana River area. So he was Catalonian. And Noguera, as far as we know, the first men that came up were single men and were stationed as soldiers or as missionaries or were under contract to the missions in Upper California. And no families were involved. Well, in 1774, Ortega was sent back to Mexico, Baja California, came up with families from Laredo. And when those families came, well, the Guerra family evidently came up at that same time. So her ancestry goes way back to the early settlers of Alta California. So that's enough on that. We'll leave this here. Well, we have pictures, and the very lower picture is my wife and I. Yeah. One of her ancestors was very famous. Sanchez, which is on here, was a businessman who came from Mexico City. He got some Spanish land grants in the Hollister, San Juan Bautista, Gilroy area. And when the 49ers first came and there was a need for food and so forth for them, he was one of the first ones to recognize that. He traded with those, got quite a bit of gold, and he drowned in the Pajaro River, I don't know, connect me if I don't pronounce it right, which is Parrot River, as he was returning to his rancho on Christmas Eve with gold. And that's what they call the Sanchez treasure in North California. People are still looking in that river to see where the gold went. Well, she was quite rich. Her name was Encarnacion, and she was quite a beauty at that time. So, okay, the second story that I'll talk to you about was Spain had trouble getting people to come to Upper California to settle. I mentioned that families that came up from Baja, but there were a lot more men than there were women around. So one of the early concepts was to take orphans from the orphanage in Mexico City and bring them to Upper California. The original goal was to have 200 orphans to come up to Alta California. And one thing or another happened, and the number that actually came was much smaller than that. But it ended up that 20 of them ended up at Monterey in 1800, and they were called Lorenzana orphans. They were all given the name Lorenzana, boys and girls both. And there are a few members of Los Californianos now. One of my big helpers when we had the library responsibility was John Lorenzana. And a lot of the other the girls, because the girls dominated in the group that came, then married into the families, which causes problems from a genealogical standpoint that I should mention. Under Spain, you know, they use 2 names, the husband and the wife. So it's not unusual to have Ortega y Carrillo. And the family name for the father, and Carrillo is the family name for the female. And from a genealogical standpoint, that's great, because once you know the name, you know them both. And that dominated, probably 98% of the families were that way. I know of one prominent deviation. A man by the name of Bodega y Cuadra was in charge of the auxiliary fort that was established at a place called Nootka, which is halfway up Vancouver Island. If any of you are watching the program Alone now that takes place on Vancouver Island, you have an idea of what that was like when the Spanish settled it in 1790. But he had the name, his father's name was Bodega, and Bodega Bay in California, which was the port that the Russians used for Fort Ross, was given that name. But when Vancouver finally sailed around that island and proved that it was an island, he went to Bodega, which is still there, under the Spanish flag with his sub-fort for Monterey, and said, well, why don't we call this Vancouver y Cuadra Island, which was his mother's name. And so he was really known, not as Bodega, but as a Cuadra. Very unusual. Okay, among these orphans was a 7-year-old girl, and she knew how to read and write a little bit at that time. She was first, as she says in her testimonial, and that's this document here, they were handed out like puppies to various prominent families. And she was handed out to one of the Carrillo families in Santa Barbara. And she lived with them until 1805, and then he was reassigned to San Diego. So she moved to San Diego at that time, in 1805. And as she grew up, she became a teacher because she could read and write Spanish and so on. So all of the families in Old Town would use her to teach their children to read and write. Well, as she grew older, she became prominent with the Padres at the Mission San Diego. And she rose to the responsibility of taking care of the neophyte Indian women, to teach them how to produce cloth and teach them how to organize things and so on as far as the women were concerned. When the secularization came under Mexico, Mexico decided that the mission should be privatized or disappeared and turned over to local people at the time. The padre at the mission in San Diego realized that, okay, their sheep were necessary for the production of cloth. And so she was urged by the padre to file for a Mexican land grant. And as far as I know, she is the first and only woman that applied for a Mexican land grant. And in 1840, she was given the land grant for the area that we know as Jacamba in San Diego now, just south of El Cajon. And another smaller piece that I don't know quite what the function was, but I think it might have been where the sheep dip was or something, that later was surrounded by a Mexican land grant for the city of El Cajon. So she had these two land grants. Working with the mission, as the mission deteriorated and so on, the padre moved up to San Juan Capistrano. And while there, she met Forrester, who at that time was a prominent businessman. How do I put this? Manipulator. We'll call him a manipulator. So many of you probably know the story between Forrester and Pico. And that was a big fight in the courts and so forth. The area that is now Camp Pendleton was involved in the two Spanish land grants and so on that were given. Well, Forrester, she contracted, she thought, with him for him to manage the Rancho Bernardo because she was too far removed from him at that time. Well, he later made an arrangement with a man by the name of Magruder, who, if you're a Civil War aficionado. You might recognize the name. He became a general in the Confederacy during the Civil War, and later was a general for the king of Egypt at that time. And they to run cattle, the U.S. Army cattle and so forth on the Macomba Rancho. She accepted some payment, and she thought that she was accepting payment for the use of Macomba. Well, one of the documents, all made in English, and she was proficient in Spanish, but not English, was to sell the rancho. So she lost the rancho to Magruder and a series of Americans after that. So as she became older, so forth, she moved back to Santa Barbara. And while in Santa Barbara in her old age, she was interviewed by one of Bancroft's people that were involved in writing the history of California and so forth, early California at that time. A man by the name of Savage. So he interviewed her and got her testimonial, and that's this document. When he first went, he was intending to interview some of the De La Guerra family, but they had a sickness in the family at the time, so he was urged to interview her, which he did, and I'm glad he did, because it gave a different viewpoint and the role of women in the early California. It was very well documented by what he did. Okay, the third story, and the main one that I'm interested in, is what I call the Peggy Project. And this really starts in 1775 in Lexington, Massachusetts. A young child was born, and it was given the name George Washington Ayres. And that's because his mother, whose name was Prudence Gray, and that's why I got interested in it. I thought at that time that she might be of my family. Well, I found out later it was widow Prudence Gray, and she had a first husband before she married into the Ayres family. She was in Lexington, Massachusetts because the British were occupying Boston at that time. So she went up to Lexington to have her child and so forth, her husband and so on. Moses Ayres stayed in Boston. Well, as this young boy grew up, he was down the line as far as the family's concerned. He had older brothers, so he went to the sea and learned how to navigate. Okay, we skip ahead to 1803. He was the first mate of the ship Alexander that came to San Diego Bay in 1803 to get water and wood and so forth, getting ready to take their cargo at the time, which was mostly fur pelts, to Canton, China. Well, the word got to the Presidio somehow that they had illegal pelts on board. And under Spain, Spain was very protective of Upper California. And anyone that appeared there, including Jedediah Smith and all of those people, were urged to get out of the country. And they'd get rid of them as soon as they could. If they weren't Catholic and weren't under the flag of Spain and so forth, they were sent out of the country, so on. Okay, so the Presidio then sent some soldiers on board the ship, and they found some 400 plus pelts, and they confiscated them. And so those pelts were then at the Presidio at the time. Okay, Captain Brown of the Alexander tried to get them back. Negotiations for what was unsuccessful. So he left, and he went down to Todos Santos Bay and Ensenada and so forth, and happened to run across another ship there, American ship called the Lydia Bird. And the Lydia Bird came up to San Diego and tried to get the pelts back. And you may know that story, because to the present day, every year there is a recreation of the Battle of the Bay in San Diego, they call it, which is when the Lydia Bird finally sailed out of the harbor and traded shots with the Spanish port at Ballast Point and so on. Okay, so that's George Washington Ayers. The ship then went up to Monterey, which was the custom to try to settle things officially with the government, because every ship that came to Northern California by law was supposed to go to Monterey to pay taxes on the goods that they were going to trade and so on. And while in Monterey, the first mate, which was the custom at that time, was charged with getting the food, water, and making all the settlements and so forth before they left for Canton, China. Well, in the middle of the night, Captain Brown sailed away and left his first mate on shore. So George Washington Ayers was on shore. And I have a copy of the letter that he sent to the governor saying that his sextant, his clothes, all this paraphernalia and so forth was on board the ship. Well, it ended up, to get rid of him, they sent him down to San Blas, which was the naval port on the west coast of Mexico at that time. And then he made his way to Veracruz and so on. They actually gave him the equivalent of $100 to get out of the country. And he went back to New England. Well, then he settled as a first mate on another ship called the Mercury. So by 1805 about, he was back in California and trading illegally for pelts, so on. Okay, as they got a number of pelts, they decided it was time to go to China, so they went to the Sandwich Islands, Hawaii, at that time. And while there, his captain was a man by the name of William Heath Davis, and this is the father of the William Heath Davis that wrote the book 75 Years in California and formed the first wharf in San Diego as part of his prominence. And maybe some of you have been to the William Heath Davis house in San Diego. William Heath Davis Jr., he imported some houses from New England. They were prefabricated and came by ship and so forth. And one of them still exists down the island, the street in San Diego. Okay, William Heath Davis then decided to leave the ship and went to work for King Kamehameha in Hawaii at that time, and was prominent in the creating of the, getting Kamehameha to be the king of Oahu as well as island of Hawaii and Maui and some of the other ones. Okay, so that elevated George Washington Ayers to captain of the Mercury. And as captain, he took on board at that same time a young Polynesian woman. And she sailed with him for close to 5 years, all around China, and for several years in that area, and then finally back to North America. And the ship was in Sitka, Alaska, when it needed some refurbishing and got a copper bottom and so on. And while he was there, George Washington Ayers made an agreement with Barnov, who was the head of the delegation of the Russians there, to take pelts because Russia was restricted by Russian law with trading with China. Well, the difference between Russia and China was way back, obviously. So he was to be the go-between. So he had on board not only Russian pelts, but he had 3 watches, Russian watches. One of them was given by the Tsar of Russia to the Baronov, so on, because of the Russian-American Fur Company and so on. And supplies for down at the Russian fort, which had been recently established at Fort Ross. So the ship then, after all the repairs, went down to Fort Ross port, which is Bodega Bay, name familiar to you by now. And while there, this Polynesian girl gave birth to a baby girl. And so she was on board the ship. The ship then left Bodega Bay, went down trading at San Luis Obispo and to Refugio Beach. Jose Ortega's Rancho concession. at that time, and it was a known place for illegal trading in California, because at Refugio you could trade with 3 missions as well as the Presidio at San Francisco and what few concessions there were at that time. While at Bodega Bay, a Spanish ship from Peru came up, the ship Flora, under Captain Noy, and captured it. And the captain from Peru had a newspaper article that said Spain and the U.S. were at war. Well, that was in error. But they took the ship down to first Santa Barbara, and took an inventory, then up to Monterey, and then down to San Blas, so on. Okay, so the captain, George Martinez, was a prisoner at that time. A man by the name of Jose de la Guerra, a lieutenant of cavalry, and the Spanish was given the responsibility of taking care of him, which he did very well, and so on. We'll find out later. And so the ship had these riches on board, including some 17,000 equivalent dollars at that time, which is
Running short.
well, I'm ready. Okay, and they confiscated some of that money to pay the soldiers because Mexico was in revolt at that time, and Spain wasn't taking very good care of Alta California. And they were much in need of a lot of the stuff that he had on board his ship, mostly cloths and so forth for their uniforms, as well as gunpowder and so forth. So the ship was confiscated. That gave the Spanish a problem then, because here they captured this ship, they weren't at war, and it was an illegal capture. So the governor of California at that time stated to the viceroy in Mexico City that is what is, how does you remember the quote?
No. What
What it amounts
his
to.
of necessity is not illegal. If you needed to do something, it wasn't against the law to do it.
Yeah, what it says in Spanish, it's in the document that I have here, is that, okay, what is necessary circumvents the law. And that's how he felt in Northern California. But at the same time, they couldn't hold the captain in captivity because he had letters from the heads of 3 different missions as well as soldiers in the Presidio urging him to come down and trade with them. So if he was going to suffer prison or whatever, they'd have to do something with the mission at the same time. So he then followed his ship down to eventually to San Blas, and he tried to get a settlement with the government in Spain and then later in Mexico City. Okay, while he's in San Diego, the young baby was baptized. So she was baptized at the Presidio Chapel in San Diego. Now she, by my recognition, is the first American child born in Alta California, because she was born to an American ship captain in Spanish waters at that time, and so that would take care of that under present law. I don't know what the law was at that time. Okay, so the godparents at the baptism were the De La Guerra, man and wife. And the godparents in those days under Spanish law meant they were responsible for this little girl. So when Captain Harris left for Baja California, he made an arrangement that De La Guerra would actually take care of the man and the woman. And in 1815, De La Guerra was reassigned to the Presidio at Santa Barbara, where he became the commandant at Santa Barbara. And that's a very prominent family in those times in Santa Barbara. So just before he left, the mother was baptized in San Diego. Well, the main thing that I was going to have my wife read what the baptism record says. And it unfortunately said two things that later gave difficulty in tracing where this little girl came from. One of them is that the padre says that he baptized this woman, this young woman of about 16 years of age. Well, I contend she was really 22, but she was a Polynesian. And I think at that time, the padre didn't have any reference for judging how old or what would look like for the Polynesian women. It also says that she is a native of Sanduchi, which is Spanish, what they called Sandwich Islands at that time, which isn't, I don't think, true. Okay. So these two women then were in Santa Barbara. The mother married into a Mexican family, a soldier of the Presidio and so on, who died about 5 years later, but had several children by him. And then she had two other children out of wedlock, and she didn't die till 1871, I think it was. Okay, her daughter then was a little bit promiscuous and so forth, but she, well, she ended up, she married, she had a child by one of the Foxen sons. Foxen was an early English Mexican family. But then she married a man who was a trapper who was with Jedediah Smith when he came west with the trappers and so forth. He was a Catholic, but he had a family in St. Louis. And so being a good Catholic, he couldn't marry her. So they lived together for 20-some years. They had one son that died as an infant, but had three daughters then that stayed in Alta California. Now, we change gears. Mutiny on the Bounty took place in 1789. And under the Mutiny on the Bounty, if you know the stories or watched many of the movies, 4 different movies that have been made of the Mutiny on the Bounty, or read Nordhoff and Hall's trilogy, includes Mutiny on the Bounty and so forth. Among those that were not mutineers, but did not have room on the little boat, the midshipmen were in the middle. Had been, most of them had been regular crewmen, but were in training to be officers. Okay, one of those was George Stewart. So Stewart and the other midshipmen, as well as a number of some mutineers and some non-mutineers, stayed on Tahiti. Well, the English being English, when Captain Bligh got back and they realized that there had been a mutiny, sent a ship to try to collect all of these people. And the Captain Edwards, by name Edward Edwards, of the ship Pandora, HMS Pandora, came to Tahiti, and that was a couple of years later. When they got to Tahiti, these two midshipmen came ashore, or came up to the ship, and because the captain had orders to collect all the mutineers, and he didn't have any idea of who was a mutineer and who was not a mutineer, he put them all in chains. And at first, they were in chains in the hold of the ship. And the weather was such that they built a little cabin up on the main deck, which soon got the title being Pandora's Box. And all of the people that they collected were put in that box.
You want me to read this while you're turning it around?
Yeah, you turn it around.
Oh. Oh.
Yeah. I always read the other one
Okay.
later.
Well, we don't have later.
Okay. In October of 1985, National Geographic had an article called The Wreck of the Pandora. This is a painting that the National Geographic had done in connection with that article, and this shows Peggy of Tahiti That's the woman
Oh, you want me to read?
holding this little baby.
He gets all emotional. Peggy Stewart was one of the last who left us. She had come on board in the morning and brought a present of hogs and fruit. She was distressed exceedingly at our going away. When we were underway and she saw she must leave us with a heavy heart and her eyes swimming in tears, she took an affectionate leave of everybody, but particularly Mr. Johnston and me. She said she loved the English and wished we would come back and live in Tahiti. Just before she went away, she came into my cabin and asked me the same question she had often done, whether I thought Stewart would be hung. I told her I couldn't tell, perhaps he would not. She then said, if he is alive when you return, tell him that you saw his Peggy and his little Charlotte, and they were both well. And tell him to come to Tahiti and live with them, or they will be unhappy. She then burst into tears with the deepest regret, forced herself into her canoe. And as long, I can't make it now, as long as we could see her, she kept waving her hand.
And according to the Tahitians, she died a few months later. And when Captain Bligh came back to Tahiti on his second trip to get breadfruit trees and so forth, in 1792, she had passed away. The baby, I still have trouble with this story because I get emotional. The baby was being taken care of by the mother's sister at that time. When the English Missionary Society first came to Tahiti in 1796, she then was given the responsibility of the missionaries. And in a book that was published in 1799, it says, and has an article and so on, which I talk about, that George Stewart's baby was in their charge and she's well. The missionaries had with them a woman who was older, 62 years old, by the name of Ayres, spelled E-Y-R-E. And she then, I'm quite sure, took care of the baby. Okay, I've been doing some research and I thought naively that, okay, DNA should help prove whether this girl was the girl from Tahiti or whether she was somebody that we don't know from Hawaiian Islands. I've done some research at first, found out there was no steward on Hawaiian Islands, and she quoted, it's quoted by taking care of the children and of the baptisms that her name was Peggy Stewart, this girl, and the mother, that is. Okay, so I then did some research. It took me 2 years, because if you're familiar with DNA, it goes from mother to daughter to daughter to daughter to daughter. And it took a long time to find daughters of the mother or the baby that were in California. I finally did. One of them's in Canada now, and 2 of them are in California. So I have the DNA for those women. I found that I got a hold of the country of Tahiti, of Pitcairn. Pitcairn is a country, whether you knew that or not. And I found the woman who was in charge of, well, you could almost call her the Secretary of State for Pitcairn Island, happens to be a direct descendant of the women that went with Fletcher Christian to Pitcairn Island. So I thought the DNA of those 2, maybe I could find a common ancestor and could prove that this baby was the grandchild of George Washington Stewart, and that the mother was the child of George Washington Stewart. They are both of the same Hapalong group, which means there's a close relationship of the 2. But unfortunately, the Polynesian DNA is a little bit clouded and there hasn't been enough information. I can't find the record to show how little Peggy, when she was 16 years old, got from Tahiti up to the Sandwich Islands to go on board this ship. But I'm still hopeful that I will find that.